Hello, Year 12. We're going to look at This Is Where It Begins by Merlinda Bobis, one of the 6 poems that you have to know really well for Module A, language, identity, and culture. Now, poets rely on the meaning of words and imagery created using words to convey the poet's ideas and feelings to their audience. Every word matters in a poem. Poets use language and poetic techniques to add meaning in a poem and not to impress. Poets use black text on white paper for their poetry rather than illuminated text. Illuminated text uses painted decoration to draw attention to the key ideas in written text. Poets rely heavily on black text, white paper, and your ability to understand the meaning of what they're writing. Okay, some definitions to look at. An allusion in a poem refers to a person, place, historical event, or ancient source, such as the Bible, folklore, mythology, ancient poets, etc. It refers outside of the poem itself to evoke a mental picture, create an image, and set the poem in a larger context or setting. So if I said The Terminator, for many of you, you might think of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the series of movies of the relentless robotic figure aiming to protect John Connor. It means nothing to you if you don't understand the backstory to which I'm referring. So illusion only works if you know the reference. Contemplation is an act of considering something. A point of reference is something that you use to help you understand a text, situation, or to communicate with someone, and it's also known as head knowledge. And because our points of reference are different, your points of reference will either help you understand something, or because you don't have the background experience, it will mean that something goes completely over your head and you don't get it. Reflection is serious, careful thought. Now, tension, in its simplest form, refers to interest in what happens next. And there's a link between tension in poetry and prose and Newton's third law. And Newton's third law tells us that when a force acts between two objects, both objects experience the same size force, but in opposite directions. So tension is created when there is a pull in different directions on an object or a person. And we see tension throughout Merlinda Bobis's poem because she's pulled in different directions as to what the origins of her storytelling identity are. So, meaning is really the ideas and feelings in a poem. Meaning is shaped and determined by word choices and poetic techniques. And it's also shaped by structure. So when we're talking about word choice and poetic techniques, we're talking about the use of allusion, comparison and contrast, including figurative language, enjambment, motif, parallel structures, repetition, shift, vivid words, and unusual word associations. And when we're talking about structure, we're not just talking about the use of stanzas, we're talking about the order of words in a line, the sequence of words in a stanza. Okay, let's talk about Merlinda Bobis's poem, This Is Where It Begins. So the poem centres on something deeply felt and true to the poet, a storyteller of prose and poetry. The poem is a contemplative reflection on the origins of the poet's identity as a storyteller. It's a reflection on her experiences in the oral tradition of storytelling in the Philippines and the stimulation of her imagination as a child and later an adult, and the point of origin for her own identity as a storyteller. The reflection also extends to the way her identity has been shaped by her forebears and the role folklore experience have had on her and the way she shares those folklore experiences with her forebears. And it's both a personal experience, but it's also a cultural experience. And it's also about the acquisition of language. Okay, so what value does folklore have? Folklore reflects the culture of a people and or a region because it relates to the way of life of the people who produce the folklore, their ceremonies, their institutions, their crafts, and so on. It expresses their beliefs, customs, values, and their way of thinking. And in this poem and in this module, we talk about collective identity, community identity, and it connects to other generations in this poem through the power of storytelling, as well as to the culture from which Merlinda Bobis comes. The way meaning is shaped in the poem. So I'm going to model for you how to analyse a poem. And I will be giving you my interpretation of the poem, how I make sense of the poem based on my points of reference. Some things in the poem, because I lack the points of reference, the meaning goes completely over my head. I don't get it. So I'm going to work through this. You don't ever blindly accept what someone says. You think critically about what someone says, and then you go back to the text and say, does this work for me? Do I comprehend this? Do I understand this? And if it works for you, then great. I've made the meaning of the poem clearer for you. If there are things that don't work for you, that you question, by all means, speak to your teacher, speak to me if I'm accessible to you, and also speak to other people who read the poem to sort out your understanding, the things that make sense to you, don't make sense to you. So let's begin with the title. The title, this is where it begins, tells the audience that the subject matter of the poem deals with the origins of something. The indefinite meaning of the word "it" introduces tension, a what moment for the reader or listener. And it arouses interest in the subject matter. At least for me, it aroused interest because I wondered, well, she's worried about the origins of something. What is it she wants to find out the origins of? So it aroused interest for me. It usually refers to objects rather than people. So I knew she was talking about some sort of behaviour, some sort of trait, some sort of experience. The wording in this title breaks the conventions of having the major words written with the first letter capitalised and most minor words written in lowercase. Well, why did she do this? From my perspective, she did it to position and align us, the readers, with her and her reflection on the origins of identity. The way she writes her title causes us to wonder, to ponder, to think, why is this so? And then the poet uses stanzas to give her poem structure and to organise her ideas. The stanzas separate different parts of the poem based on her language choices, as well as shifts in ideas and feelings. So bear with me because I'm going to go through the 10 stanzas. So stanza 1. Once upon a time in Bilko Filipino English, we tell it over and over again. So 2 lines, quarter couplet, they're non-rhyming. Okay, what's the function of the couplet? Well, the couplet functions as an orientation to the subject. It establishes that the poem deals with something that happened or existed a long time ago in a world linked to imagination. That's where Once Upon a Time comes in. The poem deals with a narrative in some way and is in fact part of a tradition of storytelling, a repeated experience. And this first stanza indicates that the subject matter, storytelling, crosses language communities, specifically Bilko, Filipino, English. The pronoun we tell it over and over again, includes the poet in a group of storytellers, a collective, a community of storytellers who share and repeat stories. While the collective pronoun we suggests a tradition of storytelling, it does not explicitly state the tradition. That tradition is revealed in stanzas 2 through to 8. And the pronoun we includes you, me, anyone who reads or listens to the poem as part of that community of storytellers. This isn't just about her. It's about us, our origins. Where did our interest in storytelling begin? Is storytelling part of our individual identity? Are we different from Merlinda Bobis, or are we part of that greater community of storytellers? Because storytellers are people who tell stories, but they also need the audience. So the first stanza doesn't state the nature of the shared stories. The focus is on the fact that the stories are shared. So stanzas 2 and 3, and I'm not even going to try and read them for you, are in Bilko and then Filipino. And when I first came across this poem, I had a what moment, and I thought, why? But luckily for me, I sat next to a man who had lived in the Philippines a lot, had strong Filipino connections, and he was able to tell me that the second stanza was Bilko and the third stanza was Filipino, and they were basically the same thing as the fourth stanza, which we'll look at in a moment. So the problem for me was, well, why did she do this? This poem was published in English, in an English anthology. Why did she do this? What did she want to convey to us? How did she want to position us to understand something that she was going to talk about in her poem? And remember, in the first stanza, she said we, including us in that collective community of people who hear stories and who tell stories. So for me, this is my reading. If it makes sense to you, accept it. If it doesn't, think deeply about it and look for an explanation. So stanzas 2 and 3 position readers to experience early childhood language acquisition, where the listener is exposed to language long before it is understood. It positions readers to experience the impact of a foreign language on an audience who do not understand the language. We're lost. We're confused. It's gone right over our heads. And it positions readers to experience the way storytelling is an experience that crosses language communities and boundaries. Stanza 4 is the first stanza that actually begins the process of reflection on where are the origins of Merlinda Bobis' storytelling identity. So she says, this is where it begins. I'm 6 years old, perhaps 5. Grandmother is storytelling about the crab stealer hiding under the bed. Every story word crackles under the ghost teeth, infernal under my skin. I shiver. So in this stanza, the form changes from the 3 lines in Bilko and in Filipino to 4 lines in English. And when it's 4 lines, we call it a quatrain. And in this stanza, the poet alludes to a shared folklore story in her heritage, the crab stealer. And the meaning of that allusion is lost if we don't know the story. So I recognise that she was alluding to something, didn't know the story, so part of the meaning was lost to me. But that didn't matter because she was talking about how her culture, the culture of her region, was passed to her by her grandmother through that story. And stanza 4 is a shared storytelling experience with her grandmother. Stanza 4 describes her first significant storytelling memory that she thinks may have shaped her as a storyteller. The story she cites is a scary story about something hiding under her bed. And when I spoke to Mark, the person who lived in the Philippines, he said, yes, it was his experience that scary stories were part of that culture and people loved to be thrilled and frightened. I personally, when I was a child, hated the idea of something hiding under my bed, so it wouldn't have worked for me. But it worked for children in that region and country. Doubt is introduced in the assertion, this is where it begins, by the use of I'm 6 years old, perhaps 5. The doubt represents the difficulty the poet, and by extension adults in general, may experience in locating how and when a concept or a value or an identity begins or where it originates. In English, when we use the word the, which is an indefinite article in front of a noun, it means the speaker or the writer believes the listener or the reader knows exactly what the composer is referring to. That is, the subject, the crab stealer under the bed, is assumed as common knowledge. And this assumption suggests that the story is a well-known story from folklore in the Philippines. Now, stanza 4's last 2 lines, every story word crackles under the ghost teeth, infernal under my skin. I just love that imagery. It's really rich. The poet uses metaphor, a form of a comparison, when she says each story word crackles. to both describe the storytelling experience with her grandmother and the impact on her. The word crackles is associated with the sound of lungs when breathing is difficult. So I instantly had this image of a grandmother, old and wheezing, and that crackling sound was embedded in her voice, part of the storytelling. And crackle is also associated with the sound of fire. And the sound of fire, to me, evoked, without her really saying much more, an image of cold winter nights and her sitting with her grandmother in a warm place with the heavy breathing and the warmth of the fire in the background. The use of fire links to infernal under my skin. Infernal is a variant word of the word in inferno. It's associated with stories of hell and the underworld in mythology. And the word crackle also refers to the way her imagination was fired and the burning, thrilling impact of scary stories on listeners. Now, the same thing happens in stanza 5. The poet alludes to a folklore story told to her by her grandfather. The use of allusion, that lady in the hills walking, indicates that the writer and the speaker believes that the listener reader knows the story is a shared folklore. And the stanza is, but perhaps this is where it begins. Grandfather teasing me with that lady in the hills walking into his dream, each time a different colour of dress, a different attitude under my skin. I am bereft of constancy, literal at 6 years old, perhaps 5. Now, bereft means extreme sense of loss and sadness, usually associated with someone's death or departure. And constancy is the quality of being enduring and unchanging, the constancy of tradition. So the thing that struck me about stanza 5 is that she had this great sense of loss, this great sense of sadness about the inconstancy of the way the grandfather told the story. She had a different colour of dress and there was a different attitude to the story that affected her each time. Stanza 5 to 6, the first lines use parallel word choices and feature the use of or and but to suggest doubt and represent her questioning. She's not sure where exactly, she can't pinpoint where her impulse to be a storyteller began. In stanza 7, I remember two father gesturing, invoking once upon a time. This is where it begins. Story, word, gesture, all under my skin. A 6-year-old, perhaps 5. So the first line of this stanza breaks the pattern of the parallel word choice and shifts the focus from the origin of the poet's storytelling identity to the way stories were told, specifically the use of gesture to invoke the world in the story and the impact. Story, word, gesture, all under my skin. The poet's experience of storytelling is both personal and individual, as well as a shared experience because she's sharing it with others, with us, and shared with her grandparents. And the word invoking suggests that the metaphor in stanza 8, which we later come across, where the storytellers are conjurers. So I'm going to move to stanza 8 now. And so this poem is for my father, mother, grandmother, grandfather, and all storytellers, the conjurers who came before us. They made us shiver, not just over crack stealers hiding under the bed or a lady uncertain of her guard. They made us shiver over tenderness. Or that little tickle when a word hits a hidden crevice in the ear, just air heralding the world or worlds that we think we dream of alone. So this stanza states that she is linked to her forebears through shared experience such as storytelling, and she extends to the type of stories that she was shared and that were shared with her beyond folklore to stories of faith, stories of religion. And she also refers to the sound of words and its appeal to listeners and readers. And so she uses the metaphor conjurers to describe her perception of her forebears, to describe her perception of storytellers. Okay, what's a conjurer? A conjurer is a magician, an illusionist, someone who creates something out of nothing. So in stanza 8, the forebears are conjurers in the sense that they use language to create a fictional world. They created the storyteller identity in a child, and they conveyed spiritual truths to her. Stanza 9 is an assertion about storytelling as a collective community experience rather than simply an individual experience. No, storytelling is not lonely, not as we claim, in our little rooms lit only by a lamp or a late computer glow, between the hand and the pen, or the eye and the screen. They have never left, they who story told before us, they who are under our skin. So those last two lines, 5 and 6, she's saying that from her perspective, her forebears are embedded in her DNA. And the final stanza, 10, is a reflection of the significance of childhood experiences and the way cultural heritage connects people across time. Perhaps they even conjured us, but not alone. Storytelling, all our eyes collect into singular seeing. Our lips test one note over and over again. Our hands follow each other's arc, each sweep of resolve. Eyes, lips, hands conjoined, the umbilical cord restored. I say umbilical, umbilical, so if you like umbilical, forgive me. The poet stresses that the cross-generational community of storytellers are linked in that they imagine the same world when storytelling, and they shared the same gestures and they speak the same words. So not only is a child learning the words of a story, not only is a child learning the details of a story, the child is learning the expression, the vocal expression, the gesture that comes with storytelling, the ability to weave a spell through intonation and through gesture. So in stanza 10, the word has changed from conjurers to conjured. Perhaps they conjured us, but not alone. So what does this mean to you? For me, initially, it referred to the miracle of conception from which human life emerges. But perhaps she was also talking about that she wasn't the only person in sharing the storytelling experience with her grandmother or grandfather or her parents who told stories as well. She continues this idea, though, of life and conception in the last line when she refers to the umbilical cord. Now, eyes, lips, hands conjoined, the umbilical cord restored. So what's conjoined? Well, conjoined refers to Siamese twins, and the word in this context functions as a metaphor. The metaphor emphasizes the closeness of the link between her forebears and her, as does the metaphor umbilical cord restored. So other things to note about this poem. Well, the poet uses repetition to emphasize the impact of storytelling in her childhood, the stimulation of her imagination, and the inheritance by her of the storytelling impulse. Stanzas 4, 5, 6, 7, 9. She repeats under my skin and states that the aspects of identity linked to storytelling and her forebears are beneath the surface. They become part of us. And under my skin suggests an uneasiness, that a discomfort that comes when you're hearing stories as well. The impact of storytelling experience is also emphasized in the repetition in stanza 4, I shiver, and in stanza 8, they make us shiver. Repetition is also used in stanza 6, eyes, lips, hands in Spanish, and then eyes, lips, hands again in English. And stanza 6, which I haven't really talked much about, is, or this is where it begins, mother reviewing for her college Spanish exam. I can't say Spanish properly, so I'll skip those next two lines. Suddenly, also under my skin, long before I understood, eyes, how they conjure ghosts under the bed, lips, how they make ghosts' hands speak, hands, how they cannot be silent. So the storytelling gesture when she says hands that cannot be silent, she's really talking about the fact that a storyteller is not just expressive with their lips, that she's not just expressive with the way they use their face, but hands are not still for her at least, when storytelling is happening. Storytelling very much involves natural gesture. That's part of the casting of the web, the weaving of magic to create other worlds. And stanza 6 describes an intensely personal experience. And if we haven't shared that similar experience, it might be difficult for us to comprehend the meaning of their lines. So the poet uses contrast in stanzas 2 to 7 by citing the different stories from her childhood and to represent the difficulty the poet, and by extension any adult in general, may experience in locating how and when a concept of identity begins or originates. And she contrasts the different languages, and she includes the learning of Spanish, which wasn't actually part of the storytelling experience, but it was the development of language and the way language is used to communicate. Now, what I want you to do, having gone through this presentation and hopefully made notes as you went, because you need study notes, is I want you to go back now to the poem, the original text, the black writing on white paper, and I want you to reread the poem in the light of what I've explained. What's working for you now? What additional layer of meaning are you getting? What do you have a deeper understanding of what the poem's about? And it'd be a good idea to rewatch this video again and make notes, annotated notes around the poem, because that will help you better understand the poem, because you need to know this poem. In fact, you need to know all 6 poems set for this module. You need to know them really well. You need to be able to know the poems, not quite off by heart, but you need to be able to quote from the poems. And you need to be able to explain what the language conveys. Thank you for listening.